2 days. That is what is left before a 50% tariff hits on Canadian goods. And as of right now, Canada has rejected the latest offer from the United States. This is not speculation. This is what Canadian officials are telling reporters directly, on the record, in the final stretch before the deadline. In this script, we are laying out exactly where these negotiations actually stand right now, why Canada walked away from the most recent offer, what both sides are demanding, and what the realistic outcomes look like as this clock runs out. Let's start with what actually happened this week, because this is moving fast. On Tuesday, August 11th, the United States put forward a new proposal during talks in Washington. According to sources on both sides of the border, cited by CBC News, that proposal would have lowered some of the sectoral tariffs currently in place, but not by nearly as much as Canada wanted. Canadian officials reviewed that offer and rejected it. 1 week before the deadline, Canada told the U.S. directly that this specific counteroffer was not good enough. This rejection came after Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, had already been to Washington multiple times in the weeks leading up to this point. By August 11th, LeBlanc had met with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer 3 times in 3 weeks. After that Tuesday meeting specifically, LeBlanc posted publicly that Canada remained committed at the negotiating table, and that Canada was continuing to, in his words, advance and staunchly defend Canadian interests. Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, was also in that room. This was not a phone call or a written exchange. This was senior officials sitting face to face with their American counterparts. And even with that level of direct engagement, the two sides still walked away without a deal. It is worth pausing on the sheer frequency of these meetings, because it tells you something about how seriously both sides are treating this deadline. 3 formal, in-person meetings between LeBlanc and Greer within a 3-week window is an intense pace for trade negotiations of this scale. Trade deals of this size, involving billions of dollars in goods and multiple contested sectors, typically unfold over months or years of slower, more measured back and forth. Compressing that process into a matter of weeks, with senior officials flying in for face-to-face meetings roughly once a week, reflects the genuine urgency both governments are placing on this specific deadline, even if that urgency has not yet translated into an actual agreement. Beyond the formal LeBlanc and Greer meetings specifically, reporting also points to a broader team of negotiators working the details in the background between those higher profile sessions. Sources have described Canadian and American trade officials mapping out potential deal structures to present to their respective leaders, suggesting the actual negotiating work extends well beyond the handful of publicly reported meetings between the 2 lead officials. This kind of layered negotiation, with technical teams working through details separately from the higher level meetings that make headlines, is fairly typical for trade disputes at this scale, and it means the public record of meetings between LeBlanc and Greer likely understates the total volume of actual negotiating activity happening behind the scenes in these final days. So what is actually being negotiated here? What does the U.S. want, and what is Canada refusing to give up? According to Trump's own public statements, the 50% tariff threat is tied to what he has described as discriminatory treatment of American-made cars, alcohol, and dairy goods. Those are the 3 specific grievances driving this entire dispute. On the alcohol issue specifically, Canada does appear willing to move. According to CBC reporting, Canada is prepared to halt the provincial booze bans, the policy where Canadian provinces pulled American alcohol off store shelves in exchange for tariff relief in other areas. That is a real, meaningful concession on the table from the Canadian side. But willingness to move on alcohol does not mean Canada is willing to give up everything the U.S. is asking for across the board. Prime Minister Mark Carney addressed this directly. Well, in comments reported by Bloomberg just days before the deadline, Carney said plainly, "Canada will not accept a bad deal." That is not a vague diplomatic statement. That is the Prime Minister of Canada on the record, telling both his own country and the United States that there is a line Canada is not willing to cross, even with a 50% tariff bearing down in a matter of days. This is exactly where the phrase Canada refuses to sign actually comes from, and it is worth being precise about what that means in practice. Canada is not refusing to negotiate. Canada is not walking away from the table entirely. LeBlanc has been back in Washington repeatedly. Negotiations are described as happening daily according to some reporting, and Canada has already shown willingness to give ground on at least one of the 3 core issues, the alcohol restrictions. What Canada is refusing to do is accept specific terms it considers a bad deal, terms that, based on the reporting available, involve the U.S. wanting preferential access on additional fronts beyond what Canada has offered so far. According to reporting on the specific structure of the American proposal, the U.S. side is reportedly seeking a deal that would grant preferential access for American goods entering the Canadian market, going beyond simply resolving the 3 named grievances of alcohol, dairy, and autos. That distinction matters quite a bit. If the American ask genuinely extends beyond addressing the specific complaints Trump has publicly cited, and instead reaches into broader preferential market access, that would explain why Canada continues to view the current offer as insufficient, even after already signaling real flexibility on the alcohol issue specifically. A deal narrowly focused on resolving the three stated grievances is a very different proposition, politically and economically, than a deal that also grants the U.S. broader preferential treatment across the Canadian market as a whole. It is worth thinking through what preferential access actually means in practical terms, since it is easy to gloss over as abstract trade language. If the U.S. is seeking preferential treatment for its own goods entering Canada beyond what existing trade rules already provide, that would mean Canadian consumers and Canadian companies facing different, more favorable terms specifically for American products compared to goods from other countries, effectively locking in an advantage for American exporters that goes beyond simply resolving the current tariff dispute. For Canada, agreeing to that kind of structural ongoing preferential arrangement carries very different long-term implications than agreeing to end a specific, time-limited dispute over alcohol shelf policies or dairy quotas. One is a negotiated settlement to a specific grievance. The other is a broader, more permanent shift in how the two countries trade with each other going forward. Why does this particular sticking point matter so much? To understand that, it helps to look at what Canada would actually be giving up if it accepted a deal it considered unfavorable. Bloomberg's coverage specifically frames Carney as walking a political tightrope heading into this deadline. That framing is worth unpacking because it points to a domestic political reality inside Canada that shapes exactly how much room Carney's government actually has to compromise. If Carney signs a deal that a significant portion of Canadians view as caving to American pressure, particularly on politically sensitive areas like dairy, which operates under Canada's long-standing supply management system, he faces real domestic political consequences at home, regardless of whether that deal technically reduces the immediate tariff burden. Canada's dairy supply management system in particular has been treated as protected, non-negotiable policy by governments across multiple political parties for decades. Giving substantial ground, there is not simply an economic decision. It is a politically loaded one that touches farmers, rural voters, and a policy area Canadians have consistently defended even under previous rounds of trade pressure. At the same time, refusing to sign anything and simply letting the full 50% tariff hit on August 19th carries its own serious cost. Reuters reporting on this dispute specifically noted that these looming tariffs could threaten what it described as a fragile economic recovery in Canada. That detail is important to context. Canada is not negotiating from a position of economic comfort where absorbing a failed deal costs little. The Canadian economy is already in a delicate recovery phase, and a 50% tariff hitting a broad swath of goods lands directly on that fragile footing. So Carney's government is genuinely caught between two real risks: signing a deal that looks like capitulation domestically, or refusing to sign and absorbing serious economic damage starting in 2 days. This is precisely why the phrase political tightrope fits the situation so well. A tightrope walker cannot simply choose the safer side and stay there, because both directions carry real risk of falling. Lean too far toward accepting American terms. And Carney risks a domestic backlash framing him as having sold out Canadian farmers, auto workers, and provincial governments that already took the politically costly step of pulling American alcohol off shelves in solidarity with the broader trade fight. Lean too far toward refusing any deal at all, and Carney risks presiding over a 50% tariff, hit landing on an already fragile Canadian economy. With real job losses and real price increases, the Canadians will feel directly in their daily lives. There is no comfortable, low-risk position available to him in these final 2 days. This dynamic also explains why Carney's specific choice of words matters so much in these final public statements. Saying Canada will not accept a bad deal is a carefully calibrated line, firm enough to reassure Canadians who are watching closely for signs of capitulation, while still leaving the door open to an eventual agreement that Carney's government could plausibly frame as a good deal rather than a bad one. That kind of careful public language, drawing a clear line without fully closing off the possibility of an eventual agreement, is a common feature of high-stakes negotiations, conducted partly in public view, where officials on both sides know their domestic audiences are parsing every word for signs of weakness or strength. It is worth stepping back briefly and remembering that this pattern of last-minute brinkmanship is not new to this specific relationship. Back in July of 2025, more than a year before this current deadline, Trump made comments suggesting the U.S. might not reach a deal with Canada at all. Standing outside the White House ahead of an earlier August 1st deadline, Trump told reporters, "We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada," and added, "I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs, not really a negotiation." Those comments came just one day after LeBlanc had told reporters he was feeling encouraged following meetings with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and American lawmakers, showing how quickly the tone of these negotiations can swing from cautious optimism to open pessimism within the span of 24 hours. At that same moment, back in 2025, LeBlanc also said a broader economic and security deal would not be signed before that particular deadline, telling reporters, "Canadians expect us to take the time necessary to get the best deal we can in the interest of Canadian workers." That earlier episode is useful context for understanding the current standoff, because it shows this specific pattern, a looming deadline, a stalled negotiation, and a Canadian government explicitly choosing to slow down rather than rush into a deal it considers unfavorable, has already played out once before in this same relationship. A professor from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, commenting on that earlier standoff, noted that Canadian public reaction to a failed deal tends to split. Some Canadians view failure to reach a deal as simply the correct response to unreasonable American demands, framing it as a matter of national sovereignty. Others view it more critically, questioning why a deal could not be reached at all. That divide inside Canadian public opinion is part of what makes Carney's current tightrope so difficult to walk. There is no single Canadian consensus telling him exactly how far to bend. That earlier July 2025 standoff is also worth revisiting because of how it eventually resolved, or rather did not fully resolve. Despite Trump's pessimistic comments that week suggesting Canada might simply end up paying tariffs without a real negotiation, the relationship continued through additional rounds of talks and adjustments over the following year, rather than settling into a permanent fixed tariff arrangement immediately after that August 2025 deadline passed. That history suggests the current standoff, even if it results in the 50% tariff actually taking effect on August 19th, is unlikely to represent a final, permanent state of affairs either. Based on the pattern established over the past 18 months, further negotiation, adjustment, and renewed talks would likely continue even after this specific deadline passes, regardless of which direction it initially breaks. It is also worth noting that back in July of 2025, Trump specifically singled out Canada for criticism while describing progress in talks with other trading partners, including Australia, the European Union, and China. He told reporters at the time, "We don't have a deal with Canada. We haven't been focused on them." That comment, made over a year before the current deadline, shows that Canada's negotiations with the United States have repeatedly stood apart from the pattern seen with other American trading partners, often lagging behind or hitting more resistance than deals reached elsewhere. That earlier pattern of Canada being treated as a more difficult, more contentious case compared to other countries appears to be repeating itself again now, with Canada and China remaining among the few trading partners that have consistently retaliated rather than quickly settling, according to broader reporting on the administration's overall tariff campaign. Now, with 2 days actually left before this current deadline, let's talk about what the realistic range of outcomes actually looks like from here, based specifically on where things stand right now rather than speculation about the distant future. The first possibility is that no deal gets reached at all, and the full 50% tariff takes effect on August 19th, exactly as threatened, hitting the broad range of Canadian goods currently covered. Given that Canada has already rejected the most recent American offer, and given Carney's explicit public statement that Canada will not accept a bad deal, this is a genuinely live possibility, not a remote one. If this happens, the tariffs apply immediately across the covered goods, and the cost consequences described in the reporting, both for Canadian exporters and for American businesses and consumers who rely on Canadian imports, begin compounding right away. The second possibility is that a deal gets reached in these final 2 days, built specifically around the concessions Canada has already signaled willingness to make. Given that Canada has indicated it is prepared to halt the provincial alcohol ban specifically, a scaled-back deal focused narrowly on that issue, in exchange for at least partial tariff relief, remains plausible in this compressed timeframe. Whether that kind of narrower deal would actually satisfy the full scope of what Trump has publicly demanded, given that his stated grievances span cars, alcohol, and dairy together rather than just one of the three, is a real open question given the reporting available right now. The third possibility is that the deadline itself gets extended or adjusted at the last moment, something that would fit the broader pattern observed throughout this 18-month-long dispute, where previous deadlines have shifted or softened rather than resulting in the harshest, originally threatened outcome landing exactly as first announced. Given how quickly Trump's own public tone shifted during the earlier 2025 standoff, from LeBlanc reporting feeling encouraged to Trump suggesting no deal would happen at all within a single day, it would not be unprecedented for public statements in these final 2 days to shift rapidly again before August 19th actually arrives. There is a fourth possibility worth mentioning as well, distinct from the three above. where a deal gets reached on paper in these final days but leaves key details unresolved or subject to further negotiation afterward, similar to how some earlier rounds of this broader dispute have unfolded. A framework agreement announced under deadline pressure, with specific implementation details worked out over subsequent weeks, would allow both sides to claim a form of resolution before August 19th, while avoiding the harder, more politically costly decisions on dairy and auto quotas specifically, effectively pushing those unresolved issues into a later round of negotiation rather than settling them immediately. Reporting on these negotiations has also referenced a sector-by-sector breakdown of where talks currently stand, suggesting that, rather than treating this as a single, all-or-nothing package, negotiators on both sides have been working through the dispute in pieces, addressing autos, alcohol, and dairy somewhat separately, rather than requiring full agreement across every sector simultaneously before any progress can be announced. If that sector-by-sector approach continues into these final 2 days, it raises the realistic possibility of a mixed outcome, where agreement gets reached on some fronts, such as the alcohol restrictions Canada has already signaled flexibility on, while other fronts, particularly dairy given its politically entrenched status, remain unresolved heading into and potentially beyond the August 19th deadline itself. It is worth being direct about what we do not know as of right now, with 2 days left. We do not know whether the daily negotiations reportedly happening in Washington will produce a breakthrough in this final stretch. We do not know exactly what specific terms Canada would consider acceptable beyond the alcohol concession already signaled, since the details of Canada's own red lines on dairy and auto quotas have not been laid out publicly with the same clarity as the alcohol issue. And we do not know how Trump himself will respond in these final 2 days, given his own demonstrated pattern of shifting rhetoric under similar pressure in the past. What is clear, based on the reporting available right now, is that this is not a situation where Canada has quietly folded under pressure, nor is it a situation where talks have completely broken down with no further contact between the two sides. Canada has rejected a specific offer it considered insufficient, while simultaneously remaining at the table and continuing daily talks, according to some reporting, right up against the deadline itself. That is a genuinely tense, unresolved middle ground, not a clean story of either total capitulation or total breakdown. For anyone trying to understand why this particular deadline carries so much weight, it helps to remember the actual scale involved. This 50% tariff, if it takes effect as scheduled, would apply to hundreds of Canadian goods according to Trump's own stated threat, layered on top of sectoral tariffs already in place from earlier rounds of this dispute. Canada, in turn, has its own counter-tariffs already imposed on U.S. autos and steel, tariffs Trump has cited as part of his justification for this latest escalation. In other words, this is not a story about one side acting and the other side simply absorbing it. Both countries currently have tariffs actively imposed against each other, and this August 19th deadline represents the next major escalation point in an already active two-way trade conflict, not the opening move in a fresh dispute. It is worth being specific about how these existing Canadian counter-tariffs on U.S. autos and steel factor into the current standoff, since they represent Canada's own leverage in these negotiations, not just a grievance the U.S. is citing. Trump has framed the current 50% threat partly as retaliation for these existing Canadian counter-tariffs, meaning any final resolution would likely need to address both sides of tariffs simultaneously, rather than only the American demands regarding cars, alcohol, and dairy. If Canada were to agree to lift restrictions on American alcohol and adjust its dairy or auto policies, without receiving corresponding relief on its own steel and auto counter-tariffs staying in place against the U.S., that would represent an asymmetric outcome favoring the American side, something Carney's government would have strong reason to resist agreeing to, further reinforcing why a quick, one-sided resolution in these final 2 days remains difficult to reach. Given that both sides have real, tangible reasons to want a resolution, Canada's fragile economic recovery on one side and the broader economic disruption tariffs create for American businesses reliant on Canadian supply chains on the other, there remains genuine incentive on both sides to find some kind of resolution even in these final 2 days. But incentive to find a deal and actually reaching one in time are two different things, and as of right now, with Canada having just rejected the latest offer on the table, those two things have not yet lined up. It is also worth considering how each side's domestic audience is likely watching this final stretch differently. Inside Canada, the story being covered is largely one of resistance and firmness. Carney refusing a bad deal, provinces having already made a real sacrifice by pulling American alcohol off shelves, and a government trying to defend politically sensitive sectors like dairy. Inside the United States, the framing tends to center more on whether Canada will ultimately comply with American demands the way most other trading partners already have, with Canada and China standing out specifically as the two countries that chose sustained retaliation rather than quicker negotiated settlements. Those two different domestic narratives, unfolding simultaneously in each country, add another layer of pressure on negotiators, trying to reach a deal that will be viewed as a reasonable outcome by two audiences with fairly different expectations of what winning actually looks like. This gap in domestic framing also helps explain why a deal that might look reasonable from a purely economic standpoint can still be politically difficult to actually sign. A trade agreement is never evaluated purely on its economic merits by the officials who have to defend it publicly afterward. It gets evaluated through the lens of how it will be covered domestically, whether it will be described as a firm defense of national interests or capitulation to outside pressure. Given how closely both LeBlanc and Greer's meetings have been covered in real time by outlets on both sides of the border, every detail of whatever eventual agreement emerges, if one emerges at all before August 19th, will be scrutinized immediately for exactly that kind of framing, adding pressure on negotiators to get not just the substance right, but the presentation right as well. So where does this actually leave us with 2 days remaining? Canada has said no to the most recent American proposal. Carney has drawn a public line, stating clearly that Canada will not accept a bad deal, even as the clock runs down toward a 50% tariff. LeBlanc remains actively engaged in negotiations, having already met with Greer multiple times in recent weeks, with reporting suggesting talks are continuing daily as the deadline closes in. Canada has signaled real willingness to move on the alcohol restriction issue specifically, while the dairy and auto quota disputes appear to remain the more difficult, unresolved sticking points. And underlying all of it is a domestic political reality inside Canada that limits exactly how far Carney's government can bend without facing serious backlash at home, regardless of the economic pressure bearing down from the looming tariff deadline itself. Whatever happens over these next 2 days, whether that is a last-minute deal, a full implementation of the 50% tariff exactly as threatened, or another shift in the deadline itself, the events of this week make one thing clear. This is not a case of Canada quietly caving to pressure as the deadline approaches. As of right now, it is the opposite. Canada looked at what the United States put on the table and said it was not good enough. That is where things stand right now, based on direct reporting from officials involved in these negotiations, and based on Prime Minister Carney's own public statements in the days immediately before this deadline. This situation remains actively developing with the clock still running. And whatever happens over the next 2 days will determine whether this becomes the moment the 50% tariff actually takes effect, or another chapter in a much longer running trade standoff between two countries that remain, even now, still talking to each other every day.